and welcome to Earnscliffe Strategy Group's ongoing webinar series. Today we're here to talk about the change of administration in the White House and American politics going forward. My name is Allan Gregg. I'm one of 40 principals at the Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Those of you who may not be familiar with our firm, we are a multidisciplinary consultancy that focuses on public affairs with disciplines in government relations, public opinion research, and strategic communications. I'm joined today by some of my colleagues and a special guest, Sarah Goldfeder, who is one of our principals in the Ottawa office, our expert on trade, Canada-US relations. Rick Anderson, bi-coastal in Vancouver and Ottawa, old friend, advisor to many political leaders in Canada, focuses a lot on energy, environmental issues. And our guest, Rhod Shaw, who is the chair of the Alpine Group, one of the world's top government relations consultants firms out of Washington, D.C. A couple hours ago, we all watched the inauguration of Joe Biden, the 47th president of the United States. What we heard was a speech that was very optimistic, very aspirational, focusing on the theme of unity. I think Charles Bird, our executive producer, counted the word unity and union over a dozen times in the course of the speech. Right about now, virtually every broadcast outlet in North America is parsing the words of President Biden. So rather than compete with him, I think we are going to try to look beyond the inauguration to what we can anticipate next, in particular what this means for the world and in Canada quite specifically. Those of you who are listening, you're welcome to ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Sarah is going to be monitoring those throughout, and we will stop a couple times over the course of the conversation and go to the audience, and Sarah can direct it either to the entire panel or to any one individual. But first, I'm interested in, as I say, while I want to focus beyond the inaugurations, I'm interested in your takeaways, in what you were hearing there and what it means for politics going forward in America. Start with you, Rhod.
Well, to me, the most important sentence I think I heard was, we must end this uncivil war. And I think that uncivil is the catchphrase for what we've been experiencing in the US. And it obviously harkens back to what, shook the country in the 1860s. And what's interesting is that is the reference point so many people have used over the last several weeks when talking about what transpired at the Capitol, the mood of whether it's Trump supporters, Democrats, that people are uncivil. I think the phrase that as I've been speaking to boards and others in the last couple of weeks is, there's been this kind of sense of righteous vengeance from each side. Who's the winner, who's the loser? And rather than moving forward, it has been about punishment or rubbing the other team's nose in it or trying to get somebody to capitulate. So when the president said today, we have to end the uncivil war, that goes to demeanor, rhetoric, thought. And so that to me was maybe the most hopeful line, because all the policies we may want to talk about going forward are still predicated on people being civil to one another and being able to.
47 years on Capitol Hill. Is he the guy to end that uncivil war?
It's interesting to me talking to Republicans and Democrats that there is a sense that they're not sure anyone can do it. But that he may be the right guy for the time, and we'll find out because of his demeanor and his rhetoric, that his disposition is to try to accommodate. Now, and you heard him say today, hear me out before you judge me. There may not be people that want to hear him out, that don't want to give him they've made their mind up and they are where they are. But I think he is trying to say that was not what Trump said 4 years ago. I don't mean that in a partisan sense, just rhetorically. That was not what he was saying. That was not what was said kind of over the last 4 years. And so I think Biden's going to try, and his disposition is there to do it. He doesn't have to fake it. I think he believes what he was saying. Whether the other team is prepared to hear that, allow him to do that, and whether he can get his own team to move. I mean, this is not a one-way street. there are millions of Americans who are looking for a president to hear them and not just listen, but to try to accommodate their views. He's got a very energized base that elected him that is going, no, we got our face rubbed in it for 4 years. We don't want you to accommodate these people. So even with his best disposition, he's got challenges from both wings to navigate that, Allan.
Sarah, what did you hear? What were your major takeaways from the speech?
I mean, I think, in addition to everything that Rhod said, I think one of the things that struck me about it was kind of the underlying and the foundational values that he spoke to, which I think are things that, most Republicans of the traditional Republican ilk, as well as Democrats, would agree with, that hard work and grace and disagreement are all things that are kind of foundational to the United States system. I think he really saw himself, and I think that this was really apparent in a particular moment in history, and this being a particularly historical inauguration speech. He didn't focus on the issues of the day so much as these really foundational issues of democracy. And I think that that's probably, while it's not a reasonable way to govern, it's a good message to send as an inaugural speech, and then to let the work of the rest of the day speak for itself. He did note kind of his areas of crisis that he believes that United States is facing. And I think we'll hear more about that later on today once the executive orders he signs are released. And we'll see kind of that work unfolding in a more partisan manner. But his speech was definitely a call to work and a call to forgive and to give each other some grace, which are all kind of those foundational, almost, Judeo-Christian values that the United States has always kind of held as the core of itself.
Rick?
Well, from a Canadian perspective, I think that there's, almost universal relief at the change of government. I mean, I know there's a few people in Canada who don't share that view, but 17% of Canadians said they would have voted for Trump over Biden. But that's of course, compared to 50% in the United States. For Canada, Trump not only shattered the goodwill and the stability of politics in America, he shattered it multilaterally. And for us, that's a big problem. We found ourselves without an active partner in the Trans-Pacific negotiations, an active North American partner. We found ourselves isolated in terms of how we're trying to deal with China. We found ourselves dealing with Brexit without knowing what America was going to do vis-a-vis the EU relationship and vis-a-vis the UK relationship. We found ourselves dealing with complexities in terms of the absence of American leadership in NATO, which is a big part of Canadian foreign policy. And we found ourselves the victim of erratic trade policies ranging from renegotiating NAFTA to all kinds of individual issues crept up over the last 4 years. So from a Canadian point of view, just the ending of the chaos and the incivility of the Trump years is a big plus. And we're probably likely to be a little bit disappointed in how optimistic we are about how smooth that makes things in the future, because there are real issues behind all of the things I just referred to. So it doesn't all go away in terms of complexity and opportunities for friction. But it makes it a whole lot easier to figure out where people are coming from and to try to sort problems out that can be sorted out.
We noted earlier, Rhod, that the inaugural speech was fairly thin in terms of issue specific and dealing much more with thematics, broad aspirational themes. But what is going to be the top priorities of this administration over the first 100 days, and what are going to be their guiding principles over the course of their four-year term?
Well, he's been pretty clear that there are 4 guiding pillars to his presidency. The first is he's got to tackle the COVID pandemic, and that's the medical response, the healthcare provision, all those things. So one is getting that under control and getting people in a safe position. The second is the economy, and that is obviously an outgrowth of what's happened with COVID. But then there's also the economy that they would like to see that is in their mind more equitable in terms of both income, wealth, et cetera. So there's going to be economic dynamics to that. The third is, climate. That is getting embedded in a way we've never seen before, which is, as you look at the directive and you look at the appointees to the cabinet that he's proposed, their directive is to go in and take a look at all policies and how they are can be helpful, or if they are harmful, how do you alter them to deal with the environment and climate change. And the fourth is racial equity. Again, I think you're going to see both out of the environmental justice kind of bucket of issues, whether that's purely at DOJ or whether it's in other domains, you're going to see them focus on trying to embed those concerns into each of the agency actions and what they ask for Congress. So we have a pretty clear shot. I mean, I think they're pretty clear. Those are going to be the four operating modes. And I think that'll be true for the 100 days as you outlined it, but also I think that's going to be what they anticipate for their 4 years.
When I was a little kid growing up, my dad used to say, if it's easy, they ask someone else to do it. I mean, what an agenda. I mean, 4 intractable problems that they have to deal with. It. A more administrative one, Sarah, though, and it's probably first up on Biden's priority list, is trying to jam it through the Senate right now, is the confirmation of his cabinet nominees. I mean, what's your take on his general approach? And I'm much more interested also specifically on the particular nominees he's putting in place that have a bearing on Canada, state, trade, environment, energy.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that's important is, even though it wasn't as clearly as articulated as Prime Minister Trudeau's promise on gender parity in cabinet and a cabinet that was representative of Canada, he's still made an attempt, I think, in the cabinet formation in the United States to put people in places that are reflective of the United States as a whole. So we see the most inclusive, racially inclusive, and gender parity type cabinet that we've ever seen in the United States, including a number of firsts, everything from first women in many positions, first Native American, first Black American, first. There's a lot of firsts in all of it. But what I think is really telling about how they rolled it out is it wasn't ever about those issues. Everything that came out of the Biden campaign was about the qualifications of these teams, and he released everything in teams. So he's clearly seeing this holistically and thinking about who's going to bring what to the table as they think about the national security team, the economic team, the foreign policy team, the energy team. And so that's been really interesting to watch, and also domestic policy team. So I think for us here in Canada, the ones that are really important are, of course, Janet Yellen as the Department of the Treasury. I'm sorry, something just happened on my screen. It looks like everybody's still here, so it doesn't look like it was what was closing down. So, Janet Yellen is obviously something that's going to be really important as we keep looking at financial and fiscal policy. But then also, Tony Blinken at the Department of State is somebody who's a known diplomat, something that'll be very comfortable for the Trudeau government and for Minister Garneau moving forward. Sorry, I think Catherine Tai and USTR will be somebody that will bring a moderating voice after we've had 4 years of a very aggressive trade policy under Bob Lighthizer. And then kind of the combination, I just want to really flag before I move on that Linda Granholm as the Secretary of Energy is somebody with some deep Canadian connections, including a maternal family who's from Newfoundland, which is a nice kind of matchup with our very own Minister of Energy from Newfoundland, our Minister of Natural Resources from Newfoundland. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for positive engagement on these things. And I don't think Canada should worry too much about some of the initial actions of the United States government. I think that, overall, there is a desire to work with key allies moving forward.
A lot of Obama redux there too. I mean, Biden's clearly drawing into his White House experience.
Yeah, and then another person who's coming in as in the National Economic Council is Brian Deese, who is also well known to Canada. So I think, and Gina McCarthy is another one, also very well known to Canada. So there's a lot of good old Canada hands that are back in this administration.
Rick, you talked about kind of the chaos that we've experienced, especially on a global level, and the uncertainty of what kind of cues we're supposed to be taking. And part of the expectation, I think, around a Biden administration is that Canada-U.S. relations are going to be better. Yeah, boom, right out of the gate. First thing that is done pretty much, canceling Keystone XL. I mean, what does this tell you about the nature of, first, what's your take on that? And secondly, what does this tell you about the nature of Canada-U.S. relations going
Well, my take on it is it's basically a reset to where we were, the day before Trump was elected 4 years ago. In a sense, it's a return to where we were at, and it's not a huge surprise in that regard. I mean, the administration, Biden has always said he was going to cancel the permit, cancel Trump's reversal of the issuance of the cancellation of the permit. So you got to keep watching the bouncing puck. But so it's not a surprise, and he actually has telegraphed it to both the federal and provincial governments, and I think to the proponent as well, that this was coming. So it's not a big surprise. I expect that it's going to still play itself out for a bit, but I don't think it's going to be. I think both governments have taken the opportunity to say this is just one in a whole buffet of issues in Canada-U.S. relations, and to position it that way as opposed to the end of the world. I mean, we've got other pipeline issues as well, and it'll be a test for Biden if those are all in trouble. But I don't think that's what people are anticipating is the case here. So, there's a much broader array of Canada-U.S. relations that stand to benefit from the arrival of the Biden administration. First of all, as I mentioned, the turn back to multilateralism. Sorry, go ahead.
I was saying, does the Keystone decision stand to make those opportunities that much more difficult now?
No, I think that why Biden did it so quickly is he didn't want it to fester. He didn't want it to be something that was interfering with all the other things that we should get on with. And he wanted to just basically say, this is my decision. This was my campaign promise. This is our previous position as an administration. And let's get that off the table because that's not really up for discussion. Let's talk about everything else.
Alan, can I just add too that rolling back that particular permit is one piece of an EO that's going to, executive order that's speaking to a whole range of different issues. So for the Americans, it's something different to, as part of a broader strategy. And frankly, also, Minister Wilkinson today made the good point that, the energy relationship between the US and Canada is much bigger than any one particular project. So I think there's a lot there that they're still going to work on.
Rhod, you were talking about how substantive the Biden agenda is and how difficult it is to manage. I mean, when we saw the Democratic win in the Senate seats in Georgia, everyone assumed, well, the path for that agenda now is obviously much easier than it was before. Talk to me about, and talk to the panel about what you see as the dynamic with this kind of razor-thin 50-50 position in the Senate and the diminished representation of Democrats in the House as well.
Well, it's a great question, and it's the one everyone's trying to unpack, right? Because to the unsophisticated observer, it looks like you have control of everything, and the Democrats should be happy. In reality, the margins are so fine that I think that the take at this point is whatever is going to become law is now going to have the sharp edges of the left or right smoothed off. That is going to be the only thing that can get through, because any handful of senators can derail a bill getting out of that body. A handful of House members can do the same. And one of the things, and I don't know if this is true, but I've had a lot of conversations around this, and I think I'm prepared to at least bet that it is true, is that for a long time now, and I'd say probably back to the Speaker Wright, Tom DeLay years, power has been getting more and more concentrated in leadership in the US Congress. For a long time, it used to be you fought to get on a major committee so that you could work on the bill. And when it came out of the committee, it went to the floor blessed and ready to go. Today, if it's a major bill, it has probably been formulated by leadership, sent back out to the committees to say, this is what you need to send me. And they manage it very tightly around the floor. what a lot of members, both Democrats and Republicans, have been chafing at that. It doesn't matter whether it's Leader Schumer or Leader McConnell. They're like, why did I run to get here where I don't actually get to impact policy? And so what I think we have an opportunity to see here is a lot of members going, wait a minute, my one vote now makes a difference. They cannot ignore me. No one can ignore me. And therefore, I'm going to be offering floor amendments. I am going to be working with somebody across the aisle, recognizing if I can get 2, 3, 4, 5 people that we're on the same page, we can block anything from moving forward, so they have to accommodate. So I think there's going to be an empowering sense, not just for the middle. I think it's across the board, and it's definitely not from leadership. And particularly with Nancy Pelosi signaling this is her last go round, you also already have rank and file House members kind of doing the proverbial looking around the corner, who is next? So one, that is going to be a significant change from what we've seen really for 10, 20 years here.
Well, in Canada, party discipline, our legislative party discipline is so, intact and severe that we kind of underestimate just how much members of Congress and senators can be free agents. I mean, is the Democratic Congress tougher to wrangle? Is it less subject to the whip than Republicans?
We all kind of joke that that's the case. The line here is, I don't belong to an organized party. I belong to I'm a Democrat. But you think of the factions Biden's going to have to negotiate. Pelosi's going to have to negotiate. The Ocasio-Cortez squad team membership got a little bit larger. That's a managing faction. The Blue Dog Democrats got a little bit larger. That's a managing faction. We haven't even gotten to a regional play. Imagine if you are from the Mid-Atlantic or the coast, you have other dynamics that cause people to unify around policy. You're going to have fiscal hawks. There are still some, not many, across the Congress. They are going to be able to have a say. So it's going to be very hard, I think, for Pelosi to get something out. I think for Schumer to get something out. But I also think because they all know it's hard from day one, it's not going to be a surprise. They all know the minute we organize, it's going to be difficult, that it's going to force everyone in between the buoys. And once you're in there, you start having policymakers go, wait a minute, I got an amendment in. I'm now interested in seeing this bill enacted into law. I worked hard. I got something in it. Where in the past, if it came on from on high, you kind of voted yes or no because you're like, I got no stake in this. I have no voice. So I'm going to be an optimist on the policy making, that whether it's tax policy, environmental policy, healthcare policy, transportation policy, I think you're going to see more occur because I think more members are going to have a feeling of engagement and a responsibility to get their ideas across the finish line.
So Sarah, probably the conventional wisdom is that the pandemic, probably more than anything else, was what sunk Donald Trump in the presidential election. I mean, what do we know about the Biden administration's priorities and plan around the pandemic, and how could that different way that they're approaching, this administration is approaching the pandemic, impact the way we manage the virus in this country?
That's a great question, because I think it's not so much the pandemic that brought down President Trump, but the way that he chose not to manage the pandemic that really brought down his administration in many ways. And I think you'll see, initially we expect to see 3 executive orders specific to COVID management. One of those being a 100-day masking challenge for the United States. So, full masks everywhere and requiring it of federal employees when they're serving as federal employees. So wherever they're at, wearing masks. So that's one step. The other 2 are really about coordination and cooperation. So putting somebody in cabinet that is there to focus on both the response to COVID and the rollout of the vaccines and the next steps on COVID recovery. And then, the last, of course, being, rejoining the WHO. So being part of the international conversation again, which goes to your last part of the question, which is really, what does this mean for Canada? And I think if you see a more coordinated effort in the United States at a federal level, where you have federal conversations, you have a president who's talking to the governors, talking to an administration, talking to the states about how to do rollouts of vaccines, how to roll out public policy steps that will kind of protect the citizens. You will also find a president who's willing to talk to allies about how you move forward. How do we start talking about travel when that becomes a possibility again? What does it look like for a continental approach? And so, I hold out hopes that there's perhaps the opportunity for a discussion for the Defense Production Act to have exemptions for Canada, so that Canada is not entirely reliant upon European production of vaccines, for example. So those are things that I don't think we thought were possible in the last administration that I think are possible under this president.
I want to get into the whole kind of continental North American, approach to the economy and energy. And it's one of the things I know Biden's talking about is shortening those supply chains to ensure that America isn't as vulnerable as it has been demonstrated in this pandemic, and whether there isn't applications elsewhere. But before we get to there, I mean, the word we haven't mentioned yet after all of this is impeachment. I mean, as if this agenda isn't full enough, the plate isn't full enough already. You've got the hearings that are scheduled, will be scheduled in the Senate. We all saw what happened on January 6th on Capitol Hill, to our horror. What do you anticipate the impact those hearings are going to have on U.S. politics and government in the next 4 years?
That's a good question, Alan.
They're all good questions.
They're all good questions. Yes, that's true. That's an especially good question. I would bet that President Biden will want to deal with that rather expeditiously, instead of letting it drag out for months and months and months. It's pretty clear. The facts are well known. People's feelings about Trump are well known. On the one side, it seems crazy that someone could incite a mob to go storm Capitol Hill looking for your vice president and the Speaker of the House and threatening to kill them and not pay a price for that, a significant price for that. On the other hand, whether or not Republican senators basically are going to want to make him pay a price for that is essentially a known fact, and it's not probably going to change by having a longer or shorter trial period. So they should, my advice, and I expect President Biden's orientation will be to resolve it one way or another sooner rather than later, and get on with the rest of trying to make things work better between the parties in the Congress, and particularly in the Senate. If he doesn't do that, he's going to find this dragging on, and it will get in the way of the other thing he's trying to do, which is to have the leadership of the two parties cooperate as much as possible on legislative initiatives. And it will spoil his overall ambition to have that occur.
I'm interested in having Rhod and Sarah chime in on this too. I mean, Rhod, you started at the top saying top issue was having to deal with the uncivil war. Are the impeachment hearings going to make polarization and that country just that much more difficult to govern?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, and different members had a different reaction to a certain degree on what happened on the 6th. They're all obviously horrified. But I will say, in talking to senators and House members, bipartisan, there were a number of them who thought they were going to die. Whether we think that's hyperbole, whether we can discount it because we now, after the fact, they didn't. At that moment in time, there were members who were spontaneously going to their knees and saying a prayer with whoever was next to them about, if this is it, think of my family, think of my children. That makes for a very strange dynamic when it comes to a vote on impeachment, because it is highly personal. This is rare. I'm not trying to make a political comment, but it is very interesting where the victim is the jury. that is different. We don't even do that in the American system. That's why we have juries that are outside. This rare confluence of events has made the people that were actually subjugated to that and feared for their lives now deciding, what do I think? Now, Rick is exactly right. Most Republicans do not want to vote. They'd like to get this passed. On the other hand, there are a couple of dynamics still to be worked out. Mitch McConnell could decide, this ties up this ties up nominations, policy, starts everything off divisive. He could decide he wants to draw this out as long as he possibly can, using whatever procedural, tools he has at his disposal to actually slow down the Democratic potential juggernaut on policy. He could choose to do that if he wants to. The other part is what the president says between now, the former president says between now and when this is voting also makes a difference. If he walks out and says what he was alluding to over the last couple of days, I'm going to start my own party, that makes a lot of Republicans free agents if they want to be. That also, if he comes out and something else happens in the country and he responds poorly to another, crisis, a problem in a state capital or something, that could also have an impact. So at the moment, right now, can they get more than 50 votes to impeach in the Senate? I mean, to convict in the Senate? Absolutely. Can they get to the 67? Probably not. But there are still potential other shoes to fall. And we don't know how much McConnell is going to play it from the procedural front. We don't know what the former President Trump is going to say. And those things could have impact as to what the vote count actually looks like.
Sarah, your views on the impact of impeachment on political culture in America?
I don't have too much to add. I think that Rick and Rhod covered most of it. What I would say, though, is that I think it was really instructive to watch the demeanor of President Trump as he left this morning from Andrews Air Force Base. He was a subdued version of himself, which I thought was really interesting to watch. There were no barbs really thrown. It was a very kind of managed and discreet farewell to his followers. And then he got on the plane and left. So I don't know what that bodes for in the future, but it feels like in some ways, and other people have talked about this before, that, this particular individual, when he has lost something, whether it be a bankruptcy, a piece of property, a marriage, whatever, he tends to just slink off into the shadows for a bit, reinvent himself, and then reemerge. And so I think we kind of need to see what that looks like before we make any clear conclusions on what the political future of it is.
Now, you've also been monitoring questions from the audience. Anything there that you want to raise?
Yeah, there's quite a few kind of on the potential for domestic agenda on the economy in the United States and on industrial policy and how that would affect Canada in terms of competition. So kind of folding in the Buy America programs, the threats of the, kind of an American procurement system, as well as, the domestic innovation initiative that the Biden administration has started to talk about. So I think that there's a whole bunch of questions on that topic. So I think really that succinctly, just to say, what do we think the impact of these domestic innovation and economic policies will be on the nearest neighbor and largest trading partner of the United States?
Rick, you want to start there?
Let's let Rhod start on that.
Let Rhod start on that then.
I think
just as background before you do start, Rhod, I mean, there's a lot of people in Canada who are saying this is a tremendous opportunity to really talk about continentalism, to really start looking at North America as one single economy, rather than worrying, I think what's implicit in the questions that you bundled here, Sarah, the competitive threat that a revitalized America might present to Canada, a more Buy America kind of threat that would pose to Canada, as opposed to we should look at procurement, we should look at energy, we should look at environment on a continental basis. I guess the question is kind of, what is the prospect of that happening, knowing something about the American mindset and kind of the America First perspective?
Well, I will weigh in on that side of it. The reality is that we do have a North American energy market for oil and for natural. We think about oil all the time when we talk about this, but it's also true for natural gas and it's true for electricity. Since emissions policy is largely a function of, or largely related to energy policy, those two issues are very intertwined, even though we don't necessarily treat them that way. One of the other areas where emissions policy or climate policy, if you prefer, is important is in the transportation sector, particularly with vehicles. And when we're misaligned with an American administration, which we have been with Trump for the last 4 years, we end up in a situation where we can't implement Canadian policies we'd like to on vehicles. We're probably going to bring back, the Biden administration is probably going to return to the track that Obama had the country on, President Obama had the country on, which was toughening vehicle emissions standards, vehicle efficiency standards, sorry, fuel efficiency standards. And Canada was going to align with America on that, and Trump interrupted it. Now I think Obama is going to be one of the first statements announcements that are probably coming forward today, that they're going to return to that track, and Canada I think will embrace that very, very quickly. We always go through a little period where we conduct our own analysis and so on, but then we adapt to American policy on that score, because it's a continental market for things that pertain to large-scale manufacturing like that, but also the energy market. Oil is an interesting example. America has had an explosion in oil production during the actually during the Obama administration and the Trump administration, as well as shale gas explosion. And so that's had a big effect on prices in both countries. It's one of the contributors to the decline in prices for both the oil and natural gas in the world, as well as in North America. We kind of forget that. But the reality is that America is still not quite self-sufficient in oil. They're only self-sufficient because they rely on Canadian imports, which are about 4 million barrels a day. And that's what makes America possible to have returned to being an exporter of oil for the first time in decades.
You're just cutting out there, Rick, so I'm going to give Rhod the same kind of question about the prospect of the integrated North American economy.
There's an opportunity, I think, here, which is, you know what has not been said in the last couple of years is, by God, we're losing market share to Canada. that is not the phrase I hear when you move around the Capitol. You know what people are concerned about on a bipartisan basis is China. They worry about what they consider to be unfair subsidization of European markets, industries, what have you. But actually, I think there's a real opportunity here, which is, yes, there's going to be more Buy America focus. There's no two ways about it. And actually, as an American, I get that. I support it. We were brought to our knees on supply chain in the last year, and it's not just can we make masks? I mean, when we had COVID hit, a singular major beef processing plant, suddenly there was not going to be hamburger in grocery stores. I mean, those kind of things were drawn through all sorts of ripple effects across the economy. So one, I think, yes, you're going to see in the infrastructure bill a preference for things like, U.S. materials, whether concrete, steel, timber, whatever. But the bottom line is, if I was doing advocacy on behalf of the government of Canada, I would be walking in and saying, actually, we are connected for all the reasons Rick just went through. We have a long history of knowing how to do this together. And actually, what you're really worried about is those that are over the ocean, because either that supply chain is not secure on just a physical military front. Second can be they are your competitors in the macro sense of we're not really hearing about whether the US and Canada are vying for supremacy over who is number one in the world's economy. That is a US-China thing. There are more things in
your policy wheelhouse. You want to address this as well?
Who are you addressing that to, Allan?
Sarah.
Well, yeah, no, I think that there's a number of different ways that this is actually, an advantage all, right? And the continental processes are going to be something that we all double down on. And you see it within the rhetoric coming out of the Canadian government, as well as I think what you'll see coming out of the Biden administration is really a desire to bring things home. But bring things home really means, kind of a continental view, especially with Canada, with, the USMCA in place. I mean, there's still some work that I think needs to be done on some technical political issues, but overall, I think there's an understanding that the trade relationships, the supply chain, the innovation that happens on both countries. One thing that's really I think good to note is with General Motors' big announcement the other day on Bright Drop, a lot of the engineering and the technology that went into that program came out of Canada. So there's a lot of connectivity on these things. So and I think that will continue to be. And I think that in the end, the most important thing to Canada is a healthy economy in the United States, and likewise.
Now, Rhod, we've touched on this just kind of peripherally, but I mean, the expectation, certainly in Canada, but I think elsewhere as well, is that probably the biggest difference in this administration versus the Trump administration is going to be their approach to multilateralism and their engagement in the world. Sarah's already talked about WHO as one of the initiatives that we should anticipate. How is this going to be different substantively? I mean, how is this administration going to treat its allies and its adversaries? And what does that mean for Canada?
We get the sense with what you're seeing in the names, and Sarah went through this at the start of who is actually populating key positions. These are people that are going to be proactive to reach out and re-engage. So whether that is by individual or whether it's by re-engaging in WHO, the Paris Accords, when you just look at actually what's happening, you see tangible, specific, actionable items, and you see personalities reappearing on the scene that I think are going to be proactively looking for feedback and engagement and multilateralism, as opposed to keeping that arm's length or actually using anyone that is not in the U.S. as a bludgeon for all that is wrong in the U.S. economy. So I think it's going to be true whether you see it in the Department of Interior, whether you see it in the State Department. I think this is going to run across the spectrum. I will be curious to see, as we try to navigate Brexit, what's going on with the EU, Boeing, Airbus. Boeing, Airbus has tied so many other industries that are not related to aircraft into these fights. How those things get worked out and the posture for that will be different. But I do want to say one thing. There is a general acceptance that one of the things that Trump did that they didn't think anyone else would do was actually throw a punch towards the Chinese. They feel like there is a sense that he was prepared to fight. Now, whether it was consistent all the time, the right manner, I'll leave that and defer that to others. But there was a sense that there were times and places where somebody needed to draw a harder line in the stand and stand there and take or throw a punch. And I will be curious to see how Biden feels he can deal with China specifically. I feel very optimistic about what will happen with Canada, vis-a-vis Canada. But when it comes to China, I think he's got kind of an interesting. He's inheriting an interesting political dynamic where if he doesn't do anything bold or strong, he's going to look weak. And Trump has called him China Joe, and Republicans say that. So the China one is the one I think is more challenging.
And even the Democrats are of the view that China has become an adversary.
Correct.
I'm interested in both Sarah and Rick's view on this also, because China has been, it seems to me, a real problem for us in terms of Canadian foreign policy. We're all over the place. We don't know whether we want to trade more with China. We don't know whether we want to, excoriate them over human rights. And if Biden is looking for more of an approach where he wants a coordinated front with allies to deal with China, I mean, is this going to have major implications for us, Rick? Mute off.
I did not hear your question, Alan. Sorry. I lost the sound halfway through that.
Well, as Sarah asked, I was asking about the implications of if Rhod is talking about the change in approach or the challenge in the approach to China in the Biden administration, because Trump has really stood up, maybe in an incoherent way, but he's made it very, very clear that he was going to hold them to account. Biden has said that his approach is more trying to, on a global basis, try to find allies and have a common approach. And what that's going to mean for Canada and Canada's foreign policy as it relates to Chinese relations.
Well, we'll welcome it, of course, because, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation here, we're standing kind of naked dealing with China alone on an issue that basically was precipitated by the United States. And that's a very difficult position for Canada to be in. And it's had all kinds of negative consequences. But the stepping back from that particular part of it, though, I mean, the whole world wants what it doesn't have and doesn't want what it does have vis-a-vis China. What we have but don't want is China stepping into a position of dominance economically and on the path to becoming the world's biggest economy, and also quite a consequential one of the world's top two military powers. And well, that's what we don't want particularly, but do have. What we do want but don't have is that China do what people were hoping was going to happen 10 or 15 years ago. It seems like so long ago now, which was to join the family of nations, so-called, and start playing by the same rules as everybody else, whether that's militarily or in trade terms or intellectual property or human rights and so on. And we've been disappointed in all of those fronts. So that's a problem for the entire world. And American leadership has essentially been absent from that, or at least I guess I would put it more ad hoc, as opposed to being driven by an overall kind of vision for how that relationship should continue to evolve.
Serves our best interest at this point in time. Sarah, you're trying to jump in here?
Yeah, I mean, I would just note that the Trump administration's policy on China was actually very strategic, and probably one place where he did some of the strongest work. If you look at the variety of different tools that he used, I mean, it went across almost every department in the United States government, and that's going to be hard for Biden to unravel, to Rhod's point. And I think that I don't know that he necessarily wants to. I think that what we have seen in the last 4 years is a China that has been emboldened by what they saw as a lack of leadership by the United States on the global stage, and a United States that wasn't interested in, gathering allies together in an alliance against China. So in all the opportunities that the Trump administration had to approach China on a variety of issues, frequently other countries would say to the United States, we agree with you on this. We would love to stand next to you on this and help, come to some sort of accord that puts China in a box on these issues. And the United States government under the Trump administration would say, no, thanks, we're going to do this on our own. Now I think you're going to see a more multilateral approach, which incorporates the issues that all of the different countries around the world face, and allows places like Canada to get the audiences that they really need to get the issues that they need to push forward with the Chinese actually on the table. I think having that, it's never just enough to have the United States leader go to the Chinese leader and say, hey, can you do this for country X, Y, or Z? You need to have that country brought into the conversation as well. And that was the piece that really wasn't happening in this last administration, is allowing, the United States needed to be seen not just as standing behind Canada, but standing with Canada. And I think that that's something that the Biden administration will work hard on. Whether or not that comes to any sort of satisfactory conclusion on the fate of the two Michaels, I think that the jury's out on that still. I think that's going to be a much harder fight.
Well, keep going. You're on a roll now. We've talked generally about Canada-U.S. relations, but I want you to specifically talk, because it's your field, about Canada-U.S. trade. I mean, where do you see the real threats and opportunities over the next few years in the trade file?
Well, I think one of the things that's really critical is this understanding that the Biden administration and the Obama administration before that had with, the use of trade as a tool in the foreign policy tool belt. The Trump administration under Lighthizer and especially the USTR under Bob Lighthizer saw trade as distinctly trade focused, completely an economic tool. And so I think you'll see a broader understanding more. I mean, I hesitate to use the phrase and for a Canadian audience, but the progressive trade agenda, where you're addressing issues like environmental regulation, labor quality of life issues, all of these different things that we talk about in the Canadian perception of trade. The Obama administration did that as well, and I think you'll see some return to that under Biden. I also think that with Catherine Tai, you have somebody who's, she's good at kind of the minutia of moving trade through, which is really critical for a USTR. And she is well versed on the China file and how to kind of reinvigorate the WTO so that it's a useful body to use against all the different complaints globally, some of them against the United States even.
Rick, you touched on this a little bit already in terms of oil and gas. I'm interested a little bit more broadly on the key strategic issues between the two countries, I think the energy and environment, very, very specifically. And I guess even more specifically than that, the emphasis that the Biden administration has put on clean tech, climate control, $1.7 trillion clean tech revolution. Is this a real opportunity for Canada, or is this a problem?
It's a real opportunity for both countries. The phrase energy transition is easy to say, and it kind of slides by, and you don't really appreciate, most people don't, the significance of it. But it's a huge part of both of our economies, and what's being prompted by the emissions reductions measures that are underway in both our countries, have been even during the Trump era in half the states. Is what's being prompted by that is enormous investment in new energy sources, wind, solar, nuclear, even hydro, and carbon capture, and all kinds of technologies that go.
You're losing your audio again, Rick. Any way you can get it back? I'll come when it starts working again. You can finish your thought. But first, Rhod, this is a good question. It's arguably unfair, and it's difficult to answer. But we know that Biden wants to re-engage the world and assume that position that America has enjoyed historically. Joseph Nye famously talked about soft power. That you lead by virtue of not simply diplomacy, but having the moral authority to lead. Has the United States moral authority in the global community over the last 4 years deteriorated to such an extent that it's going to be that much more difficult to assume that role?
Well, I think moral authority is in the eye of the beholder. So you can say you have moral authority, but if no one believes it, it doesn't matter. And so I would argue that's, I don't mean to deflect the question, but I mean, you have to go to the capitals around the world to say, do you believe, whether it was under Trump, now under Biden, does the U.S. hold a position that it used to hold? My feeling from talking with friends across our network, to be candid, as we work with our colleagues from around the world, is the U.S.'s position has been diminished in the last 4 years by the posture and the rhetoric it has taken towards many of its colleagues. I don't think you can. I always had the sense in conversations with friends around the world that they were saying, we thought you were different, or we thought you were better. Now, the good news is that may be seed corn you can live on, which is when you come back, they go, okay, we recognize you. That's what we thought. And so maybe there's an opportunity there to build on something. But the other part is when you lose your reputation a bit, it is, you don't get it back the next day. You don't just get to walk in and say, I'm different. And I think the real challenge for the US is the US itself doesn't know where it stands, because there are so many people. I go back to my righteous vengeance opening line, which is there are so many people that felt their team either lost or had something stolen. So they don't feel that the country is on a moral high ground, because they don't think it's that the election's outcome was the way they think it should be. So it's hard to project to the rest of the world this uniform, hey, America is completely realigned, found itself, knows its North Star, and is moving in that direction. So I as you do with your children, you're kind of left having to go, you've kind of got to earn the respect. You have to be able to say, I've set these rules, I hold myself to them before I expect others to. And so I think that's a moral challenge every day of the week. And so I feel we're in a diminished position. I'm sure there are others out there who think that the U.S. asserted its authority and had tried to do good work in the Middle East or whatever it may be. You can try to find different perspectives, but the House is divided. Biden gave a good opening statement of what he wants to try to do and what he is asking of others to hear him out too. That may make sense, but it is a House divided, and today did not resolve that. It just put it in a different trajectory. And so how we deal with each other, I think, is going to be how the rest of the world says, well, how are you going to deal with me?
We're running out of time, and we promised the audience that they would have some questions put forward. So Sarah, do you have another one there that you want to put to the group?
Well, the good news is a lot of the questions were on China, and we had a good discussion on that. Okay. So I'm going to call those answered. Some of the other ones that are out there are kind of a little bit more granular on things like the Regulatory Cooperation Council and on the Paris Accord, and other kind of pieces of bilateral or multilateral tools that we use as a basis for the relationship. So I would just kind of perhaps pose that to, I don't know if Rick's available but maybe to Rhod as well. The regulatory harmonization project that we undertook with the United States, back in the 2000s, early 2000s, that project still kind of exists, but has gone silent in the last 4 years. And I don't know if there's much opportunity there still, or if that's something that is just kind of noise in an otherwise very full agenda.
Well, we only have about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to spare all of us that granularity and say to the people who've asked this question, if we haven't dealt with them in the panel, we will deal with them in writing after the fact, or in person, in terms of picking up the telephone and having a conversation on that. So everyone said on Twitter today, I just exhaled. Canadians said, I just exhaled. There's an anticipation now, notwithstanding my earlier unfair question, Rhod, about moral authority, that the last 4 years was an aberration, and that what we're going to see right now is a return to normalcy. Chaos will be reduced. Are we being naive? Final thoughts.
Yeah, I think we're being naive. This country, as I said, this country is divided. When you listen to Trump supporters, they see the world very differently than a Bernie Sanders supporter. And you can start finding your factions on this. So this country has a lot of work to do on itself before I think everyone else around the world can feel confident that it knows where we will be, who we are, how we define ourselves. Yeah, I think I don't think today was a final, nail in the Trump world, and now we have pivoted 180 degrees a different way. It's somebody's different at the helm of the ship, but it is still going to take a while to turn it. If you're asking for final comments, one of the things that I've talked to a number of leaders about is, what actually presidents usually deal with? Military related problems. What are the core things everyone agrees the federal government is supposed to do is keep us safe, deal with defense. I never know what's going to happen with North Korea, nor does probably anyone else. I don't know what the Chinese do in the Straits. You can kind of run around the globe. I don't know what happens with Iran. The other thing that we talked about, these 4 things that are on his agenda, they're all brutally hard to do in and of their own. I have no idea what happens if we throw in what is normally the typical fungible moment, which is something that is international that no one has anticipated. And so to me, those are the 4 he thinks he's dealing with. And I'm assuming there's a 5th no one sees coming, that is always the one that actually dominates. That was true for George Bush. That is just kind of the state of human beings. So those are the kind of concerns. Now, I will say this as to your point about where we are today and what can you expect of the U.S. We are kind of tired of fighting with ourselves. And while there are vocal wings, you do get the sense when you made the point about exhaling, the number of texts I have had today that involve the word I can breathe or I'm breathing differently, Republicans, Democrats. So they may not breathe relief because they are thrilled with what a Joe Biden administration will do, but they do breathe differently today than they did before the inauguration. And so this is a moment, this is an opportunity for us to redefine, reshake. I have a colleague who is afraid, shake the Etch-a-Sketch. We have a chance to start again and try to turn the knobs to draw the picture we want. And today was the day that occurred.
Final thoughts, Sarah.
I think that all that is very much true. And I think that really, the defining issue for the next year is going to be both the COVID response and the COVID economic recovery for this presidency. And I think that, you know, as much as we would like to see the United States perhaps back engaged globally, I think that it will be very measured and in ways where it believes that it can make a difference, because it's going to need to both, you know, kind of gather the political capital to function globally as a global player again. And also it's going to just have to be able to muster the troops in a way, right? I think that there's a real question as to what the economy is able to do, how much it's able to recover in the next year or two, and at the same time keeping an eye towards China, who's already kind of been able to build back a substantial economic recovery. So I think that there's a lot for this president to accomplish and to do, and I think that there's a lot of expectations that he's not going to be able to live up to. So I hope that we can all kind of take his messages from today about, you know, being gracious with each other and being gentle with each other a bit to heart, because there's going to be a lot of strife, I think, to continue the next 4 years.
Last minute to you, Rick.
Sorry, my internet hasn't been working better today. You know, I think the rest of the world has watched America in the view of the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, the democratic world, and seen a country that's looking into the abyss of its democracy failing itself, and hoped very much that that's been a learning moment for American political culture, and that the desire to reinvent some new idea, some updated idea of the common good, and to work together to achieve that will now assert itself. But perhaps that's too much optimism. But I think that's what the rest of the world, and certainly most Canadians, are hoping.
Good conversation. Sarah, Rick, Rhod, I want to thank you all very much for joining me. It's been my pleasure, truly. Those who've tuned in, as I said earlier, that if we didn't get to your question, we will get back to you either directly or via writing. We'll also send you all a recording of this webinar that you'll receive in the next 24, 48 hours. And otherwise, we hope you continue to tune in as we schedule these as the topics would suggest we do. Thank you all so much, and be well and be safe.